Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I am your host, your imperator, your first citizen, TsarOctavian. And I would like to note, going forward, we are only using pictures and GIFs for this series because I received not one, but two copyright strikes on my last video. Well, more copyright notices, but you get what I'm saying. And to avoid that again, we are going to go forward, and even if it's a slideshow, because unfortunately some wrestlers just don't have a whole lot out there, then I apologize in advance. With all that said, let's go ahead and let's get started, shall we? After being trained by her older brothers, Mae Young became an accomplished amateur wrestler while in high school. One day, while reading the Tulsa newspaper, Mae would read about a wrestling show which featured the women's world champion, Mildred Burke. Mae Young, who grew up impoverished during the Great Depression, had no clue that pro wrestling was not the same as amateur wrestling. She and her brother would travel out to the show, and afterwards she would march right up to Billy Wolf, demanding a world title match with Burke, confidently stating that she could beat Burke. Impressed with her confidence, Wolf had Mae wrestle two of his other girls who were still in training. Mae would beat both in mere seconds. Once again impressed by her ability, Wolf offered to get Mae properly trained. Mildred Burke herself would take Mae Young under her wing, and while training, Mae would meet and impress Ed Strangler Lewis, who stated the following: "I don't like girl wrestlers. Women should be in the kitchen. But after seeing you, you were born to be a wrestler." This is the 1930s, 1940s, so ladies and gentlemen, don't be surprised. Burke and Young would perform for the U.S. Armed Forces during World War II, and Mae stayed very loyal to the woman who trained her. Burke and Young became the very first women to tour Japan in the sport of professional wrestling after World War II, now proclaiming herself as the Queen and the Great Mae Young. While touring with Burke in the States, Mae would earn the NWA Florida Women's World Championship, becoming its inaugural champion. She would also become the very first NWA United States Women's Champion. She would continue to wrestle up until the 1970s, before briefly retiring for 20 years. Former CIAA champion, trained by Canada's Stu Hart, the very first black wrestler to challenge for an integrated world championship, this is the one and only Luther Lindsay. After being trained by Stu Hart in Canada, repeating myself, as well as taking his wife's maiden name for his stage name, Luther Lindsay would tour the American South, earning the U.S. Negro Heavyweight Championship. During these tours, his main rival would be fellow black wrestler Shag Thomas, a war veteran I unfortunately did not account for in my World War II installment. Nonetheless, Lindsay became the very first black wrestler to perform just barely south of Washington, D.C., taking on white wrestler Ron Wright. The National Guard was brought in just in case the crowd started a riot. However, this was unnecessary, as the audience began to loudly show their support for Lindsay, even over Wright, in their match. Everything went so well during that match that it broke barriers and allowed black wrestlers to frequently perform in the capital of the United States. As mentioned earlier, Luther Lindsay is the very first black wrestler in the sport to compete for an integrated world championship, and he did so by going to a time limit draw with the world champion at the time, Lou Thesz. Very rarely would a wrestler be able to keep up with Lou in the ring. And as a side note, I would like to mention that many wrestlers wouldn't want to work with Lou because Lou was incredibly intense in the ring. But Luther Lindsay was almost as good in the ring and as a shooter as Thesz. If you wanted to earn Thesz's respect, being that damn good and pushing Thesz to his limits was a great way to do just that. The two men would continue to feud on and off for the next 4 years, practically most of the 1950s. I couldn't find any info on why Lindsay never got the belt. Thesz probably wouldn't have had any problems dropping it to Lindsay. It may just come down to two things. One, Lou was making the NWA just that much more money. Or two, Lindsay just didn't want it. There's rules and regulations you must follow as world champion, including being told when and where you'll be wrestling, the radio and the TV interviews, all that. And also, if you want a vacation, you're going to have to clear it with a whole lot of people. Ultimately, unless I ask Jim Cornette, who might know, or Bill Apter, I probably will never know. Earlier, I mentioned that Luther and Thesz had a 4-year on and off again feud, and I was not exaggerating. As I read through the incredible life of Mr. Lindsay, it tickles my funny bone how consistent it is for accolades that Lindsay achieved, followed immediately by, oh, and he also wrestled Lou Thesz to a draw. As an example, January 10th, 1954, Luther Lindsay wins one half of the NWA Hawaii Tag Team Championships. By spring, he then wrestles Lou Thesz to a draw. 1955, Lindsay becomes the very first black wrestler to wrestle a... The article says interracial, but I respect these athletes too much to do that to them. The very first black wrestler to wrestle in an integrated match in the state of Texas against a wrestler named Duke Kiyomuka. I apologize if I got that wrong. He then wrestled Lou Thesz in Dallas to a draw. His entire time during his Texas tour consisted of feuding with Duke Kiyomuka, fighting Lou Thesz to a draw, and then finally spicing things up by fighting Whipper Billy Watson, who had won the NWA World Championship at that point, to, you guessed it, a draw. Since we are exiting the 1950s as far as Luther Lindsay's career is concerned, we will surmise the rest of the 60s as so. For the rest of his career, Luther Lindsay would continue to enjoy being one of the biggest stars in the industry, racking up a ton of tag team titles, winning singles gold with the NWA Hawaii Heavyweight Championship, the NWA US Hawaii Championship, and the NWA Pacific Northwest Heavyweight Championship. 21 years into his career, 1972, Lindsay was facing a wrestler known as Bobby Paul. 10 minutes in, Lindsay would hit a splash or a diving belly flop, as the article refers to it as, and upon landing upon his opponent, would suffer a massive heart attack, dying on top of his opponent. Police were eventually called into the ring, but it was too late, and Luther Lindsay would be declared dead on the scene. Lindsay's legacy is that of a barrier breaker, a submission master who went toe-to-toe with some of the all-time greats in technical ability, a tag team specialist who toured all over the world, paving the way for every black wrestler after him. It could be argued that the sport of professional wrestling would not see a black wrestler superstar on his level until the Junkyard Dog of the 1980s. Lindsay, one of the biggest wrestling superstars in general of the 1950s, was unfortunately tragically taken away from us far, far too young. Former Marine, Navy frogman, accomplished amateur wrestler, and briefly former football player, who left football because pro wrestling paid way better. This is Verne Gagne. Just 1 year into his pro wrestling career, Verne would capture the NWA Junior Heavyweight Championship, and that was all that was really written about that. Flash forward another 2 years later, Verne would go to work for Fred Collier and become a massive star on the Dumont Network, wowing audience with his incredible technical ability. Holding the NWA Chicago United States Championship, Verne was rumored to have been making $1.2 million a year in today's money. By 1957, cracks in the NWA Foundation began to show. People loved Whipper Billy Watson, Wild Bill Longson, and of course, Verne Gagne, the original replacement for Thez, handpicked by Thez. Dick Hutton had tanked in popularity. Hutton, while technically sound, was a bit of a charisma vacuum. With sales down, the NWA busted out Old Reliable and handed the belt back to Lou Thez. This began to frustrate other promoters in the NWA. Edward Carpentier defeated Thez for the belt. However, the NWA would overrule the referee's decision and gave the belt back to Thez again. Frustrated with the decision, promoters in the Nebraska territory would refuse to recognize the overrule and began to recognize Carpentier as the true NWA World Champion. And while the NWA never saw him as NWA World Champion caliber, Nebraska thought otherwise and had Verne Gagne beat Carpentier for the belt. Verne, on his part, had also been frustrated with the NWA office. He was a massive star and had only won the unofficial version of the NWA World Championship, as well as being incredibly wealthy at this point. Gagne would leave the NWA and would found his own promotion in Minnesota. Taking inspiration from the great Gorgeous George, Dutch Road became one of the most iconic bad guys of the 1950s and then 60s, when he transformed into the Nature Guy, Buddy Rogers. The Nature Guy moniker eventually changed to the Nature Boy, which meant wrestling just came naturally to Buddy Rogers. Oozing charisma, a fantastic physique, and over-the-top personality, Buddy knew exactly how to piss off audiences across the United States. Behind the scenes, as Buddy's star began to rise, he encountered a problem with the world champion, Lou Thez. Thez's issue with Buddy was that backstage, Buddy was a hard-to-love individual. Buddy often came backstage with an entourage, which was and still is a huge no-no, as well as Buddy had picked up his very first big win in the business back in 1939 against Ed Lewis. It was said that after doing the honors for Buddy, Rogers was incredibly disrespectful towards the Strangler. This carried over to Lewis's protege in Lou Thez, who repeatedly refused to lose to Rogers. With Nebraska rebelling against the office, losing a massive star in Verne Gagne, the New York territory, Capital Wrestling, ran by Tootsmont and Vince McMahon Sr., became more and more frustrated with the office as well. Mont and McMahon constantly pushed for the more dynamic Buddy Rogers to be NWA champion, as he was one of the top grossing wrestlers in that area. However, Thez would continue making the NWA a fuckload of money and really wouldn't stop making a ton of money for the company until the 1970s, finally caving to demands after a vote was held and after Thez dropped the belt to somebody else, who we will be discussing in a future episode. Rogers was voted to be the next NWA World Champion. Billed as the match of the century, Rogers secured the NWA belt. The show itself would be the highest grossing pro wrestling show in the state of Texas and would hold the record for 23 years. Rogers' winning attitude backstage, as well as alleged favoritism from Northeastern promoters, led to Bill Miller and Carl fucking Gotch, that's a huge one for the history of Japanese pro wrestling, by the way, would confront Buddy backstage and would proceed to break his hand. Now injured, the NWA had no choice but to have Buddy Rogers drop the belt to his rival, Lou Thesz. There was rumors that due to personal animosity between the two, Buddy may refuse to drop the belt to Thesz. So, NWA boss Sam Muchnick came up with 3 safeguards. Number 1, instead of a traditional 2 out of 3 falls, this contest was for 1 fall. Muchnick also recommended that if he suspected anything funny from Buddy, to shoot on him and take the belt back. And for the record, this is not going to be the first, this is not going to be the last time, I should say. The final safeguard was Muchnick had let Rogers know that if he didn't do business, his champion's deposit would be donated to charity. A little explanation there was that the NWA would have their world champions give a deposit of $25,000 to the NWA board to create a sense of loyalty, like they invested into the company. And their champion would, of course, get their monies back after losing the belt. After all that, Buddy did drop the belt to Thesz and spent some time off to recover from his injuries. Returning from injury, Buddy Rogers would stick to being one half of multiple tag team championship reigns, probably to keep Buddy out of trouble. Towards the end of his run, Rogers would receive a career-altering phone call. He would get an invite to join a newly independent Capitol Wrestling, which also had the support of Fred Collier. Capitol Wrestling wanted to bring in Buddy to become their very first world champion. Back in Minnesota, Verne Gagne's new promotion, the AWA, would have their own world championship, not the Boston version. From 1949 until 1960, 11 years, the NWA World Championship would enjoy the prestige of being the only world championship in pro wrestling. And to this day, 1960 remains the last time where there was only one world champion in the sport of professional wrestling. We will pick up again with Rogers in a later installment. For now, we will end the episode here. I've been your host, Imperator, First Citizen, TsarOctavian. Have a blessed Sunday. Gloria Romay.